Yeah, you're
Michelle, are
fine.
you able to give that a quick edit before you start the streaming, or do you want to just take it down?
I'll just take it down.
Okay, that's fine. Just tell me when we're up and streaming.
Okay, you are live.
All right. Thank you, Michelle. This is Chair French, and I am convening the special work study that we have scheduled for today, January 10th, 2024 at 9 a.m. In docket numbers 24 EKME 253 CPL and 24 EKCE 254 CPL. And the purpose of this is a presentation and discussion on Evergy, Kansas Metro and Evergy, Kansas Central compliance filings pursuant to Kansas House Bill 225, K.S.A. 1237. We do not have a written agenda that we've passed out for today's um, work study session, but I understand the parties have proposed that staff would sort of give a brief introduction of why we're here and a brief history of what we're going to hear. And then Evergy will have a presentation on its transmission planning activities pursuant to what's laid out in statute. Staff will then give a brief summary of staff's review and next steps. And then pursuant to statute, we'll have an opportunity for the commissioners, staff, and the interveners to ask any questions about the presentation. And perhaps we would take questions during the presentations. I'll leave that up to the presenters. So at this time, um, well, let me say one final thing before I turn it over to the presenters. Everybody knows what weather we've been dealing with, and not the least of which is Evergy. And just want to say I appreciate the regular updates that we've been receiving. I understand as of last night, a little before 10 o'clock, you had about 85% of your customers with outages back on, and we're hoping to get that number to 90% pretty soon. We hope that that's going well, and just want to extend our thanks to all the field staff that you've had out there doing that work. I know customers appreciate it. So we will all be crossing our fingers over the next 7 to 10 days. I know we've got a big cold snap coming up, so hopefully everything will go smoothly. So with that, now I will turn it over to Ms. Carly Mazantine for a brief introduction of the work study today.
Thank you and good morning all. Yes, so as Chair French indicated, I'd like to start us out this morning by first extending a thank you for the party's participation and to those participating by watching on Zoom, and give a brief explanation of the events that brought us here today. So last legislative session, House Bill 2225 enacted various amendments to K.S.A. 66-1237, which is the governing statute pertaining to the collection of transmission delivery charges by Kansas public utilities from their retail customers. The amended statute requires a Kansas public utility to undergo annual compliance measures to facilitate commissioner and commission-authorized intervenor review of the transmission projects before the utility can recover transmission delivery charges. Now, one caveat here is that the statute is concerned with transmission facilities constructed as a result of internal or local planning processes by the utility, not those that result from a notice to construct from Southwest Power Pool. So the projects being discussed today have not been selected for construction by our regional transmission planner, but rather through local internal utility planning measures. And the compliance measures required by the amended statute include an annual filing, which details the transmission projects with costs of over $15 million. This filing is to include such detail as project identifier, anticipated in-service date, cost, location, description of associated reliability benefits of the project, classification of the project, and if that project is classified as a rebuild or an upgrade, a description of the original vintage of the replaced facilities, and to the extent applicable, a description of load addition or economic development benefits associated with a given project. A further requirement of the amended statute is that the utility must conduct a technical conference with commission staff and the Citizens Utility Ratepayer Board, as well as any other commission authorized interveners within 90 days after its filing. And finally, the utility must also participate in a commission-held public workshop and present the details associated with the transmission projects for the succeeding calendar year within 120 days after the filing. So on September 15th, 2023, Evergy Metro filed a compliance filing in 24 EKME 253 CPL, and Evergy Central filed the same in docket 24-EKCE 254 CPL. Each of these filings detailed Evergy's internally planned transmission projects over $15 million in cost and the details required by statute. Evergy presented the same at a technical conference held with CURB and the K.S.A staff on November 28th, 2023. Evergy proposed the date and time for today's public workshop to further fulfill its duty under the amended statute. So with that, I will turn it over to Evergy to begin the presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Carly. I will share my screen and we will get started. While my computer is doing that, Chairman French, to your point earlier, we're fine with taking questions throughout the presentation. So we'll have two different section breaks while we transition between speakers, and then we'll have an actual break in the presentation. So you're welcome to ask questions then, or if you want to just interrupt us as we're talking, that makes it easier for us to keep track of what the questions are about. So
I will make sure to allow time for questions at the end. So if anybody doesn't want to interrupt, just know that there will be time for questions at the end, particularly at the section breaks, if Kayla lets me know when those are. But I will also watch for hands if people want to just raise a hand instead of barging in. So we'll keep an eye out, and I'll try to let you know if I see any raised hands, Kayla.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So can you see the screen, Chairman French?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So for today's discussion, we have a few different objectives and topics we're going to cover. Some of it is specifically related to the projects that were in the compliance filing and the specific projects that we've talked about through this process. But we also wanted to include a little bit more detail on how we work with the Southwest Power Pool, or SPP, on transmission planning in general, how that process interacts with our planning. Then we'll go into detail around our local planning processes. How do we identify projects like the ones in this filing? We'll have some more in-depth discussion about how do we prioritize different projects based on the value that they provide. And then finally, we'll get into the specific projects within this year's compliance filing. A couple of things I want to note before we get into this is that we're only providing what we can provide about these projects publicly. So it might be a little confusing because we don't have the names of the projects, but we are trying to highlight specific drivers of each of them. What is the voltage and what's the work being performed without having the confidential information about where the projects are located. So if you have any questions, we'll try to answer as much as we can publicly. And then if we have to go into confidential session at any point, we can cross that bridge when we get there.
Kayla, have you talked about whether you could share general locations, and do you have an ability to describe generally where some projects are?
Yeah, each project will have a Evergy division listed, which is the closest city or metro area typically. That's probably about as specific as we could get.
Okay.
But yeah, we do have
Thank
that
you.
information. All right. So I will get into next. We've used versions of this slide in past workshops on our capital plan, but we wanted to show this again to remind folks of how our transmission investment is typically broken up. So I'll start on the right-hand side of this slide. And what we'll spend most of our time talking about today is what we call performance projects. So those are the projects that are identified to address reliability, asset aging condition, operational issues, those projects that we're identifying based on our local knowledge of the system. So when we go through this process as part of this statute in the future, it will generally be focused on projects in that area. When we get to the details of the projects, there are a couple that fall into the mandatory and SPP directed category within this year's filing. So we'll talk about that when we get there, but generally we will cover performance projects in this process. So moving to the left, mandatory projects will typically be driven by things like new customers where we need to invest in infrastructure to serve their load, road moves that are requiring us to move our infrastructure, any compliance requirements, or just our annual amounts for things like storm response or reactive replacements or repairs. SPP directed will not be the scope of this this statute typically, but they will fall into two buckets where you have service requests where we will be directed by SPP to do something related to, for example, a generation interconnect or transmission service request, and we'll be reimbursed for that cost of the upgrade. And then you have things that are called base plan funded in SPP language. So I'll talk more about the cost allocation of base plan funded projects in a few slides, but those are situations where we get a notification to construct or an NTC from SPP, and then those costs are allocated based on the voltage of the project. So like I said, most of what we'll talk about in this presentation is performance projects, but I wanted to do a little overview of the coordination between our process and SPP just for education and to see if that is useful. So when we talk about how we divide studies and responsibilities between SPP and Evergy, they're broken into two categories where on the left-hand side, we are focused primarily on kind of more local or more granular needs on our system. SPP is looking at the system overall across the whole region. And so they're not focused as much on what is the condition of certain assets or the age or what are more granular local needs that we can see. And that's where we'll focus most of our efforts. Then SPP on the right-hand side has all these different parts, these types of studies that they're performing for generation interconnect, retirement of generators, for transmission service, or their annual integrated transmission planning assessment. And then there's two bullets on both sides that are in bold because we actually coordinate with SPP and both perform delivery point additions and NERC compliance studies. We perform slightly different parts of the studies and can do them in slightly different ways, but those are shared areas of responsibility between Evergy and SPP. But even for the items on the right hand of the prior slide where it was an SPP study, we're working really closely with them on how they perform those studies, so what inputs go into them. We're providing things like updates to our system topology. If we've done upgrades or anything that changes the transmission system, we provide that information to SPP. We're also providing load forecasts and where we expect any new loads to show up on our system. We provide that to SPP. We tell them anything about planned retirements, and then we give them the list of contingencies or call it system events that they're going to need to study in their assessments. And then once SPP performs their study, there's another round where we're providing them estimates and looking at the feasibility of solutions that they've identified to different needs. And then we actually are participating in the review and approval of notifications to construct out of those studies. So it's a very iterative process on all of those SPP studies, and we work really closely with them on all of them, but there are different responsibilities between us and SPP. All right, next, this is the last slide on SPP before we get into details of our local planning processes, but just a reminder on cost allocation. As I mentioned before, there are some projects that are SPP directed, which are called base plan funded. And that is what makes a project be cost allocated based on what, if you've heard it called highway byway. And this is a summary of highway byway cost allocation, which is looking at if a project is driven by an NTC that SPP issues, it will be cost allocated between the region, which is SPP as a whole, and the zone where the project is located based on the voltage. So I think it helps a little bit more with an example. So if there's a project identified by SPP in Oklahoma, for example, and it's a 15 million annual revenue requirement impact. So if that project was a 345 kV line, so it's in this highway category at the top, 100% of those costs would be allocated across all of SPP. So Evergy is about 20% of SPP. That means that Evergy would end up paying for 3 million of that 15 million based on our load ratio share across all of SPP. If that same project was instead between 100 and 299 kV, so say it was a 138 line, only 1/3 of that would be allocated to the region, which means that of our $15 million annual cost, $5 million would go to the region and Evergy would pay 20% of that, so $1 million. And then if it was a 69 kV project, it would be 100% allocated to the zone, which in this example is in Oklahoma. So we wouldn't end up paying for any of those costs. Just to explain kind of the mechanics of how highway byway works, if you're not familiar with the SPP concept of a zone, basically SPP is broken into 18 different zones. And so Evergy Kansas Central is one, Evergy Metro is one, Evergy Missouri West is one. And that is determining what, if you talk about zonal, that's what that means in SPP language. And in the appendix, if we need to get to it, we have a map of the zones within SPP. All right, I'll pause real quick. Any questions on SPP? Because from here, we're going to leave SPP and get into more local planning.
I don't see any hands in our participant list, but if anybody wants to speak up right now, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. This is Josh France with Curb. I think my one question probably for the day is going to be about this slide here. We've had calls from customers who say that they've heard, they read an article or just that they've heard that the TDC charge, they've heard that 2/3 of that is going to other states. So, I mean, can you maybe expand a bit, or do you have maybe an estimate or any idea of how much of that, like the entire TDC charge, is actually going to the region, or maybe just expand upon that idea that not all of the TDC is Kansas dollars going to projects in other states, right?
Yeah, I don't know if I can specifically break out the regional share of the TDC, but what I have heard asked is about what share of SPP, overall SPP transmission costs does Kansas pay? Is Kansas paying 2/3 of overall SPP transmission costs? And that is not the case, because Kansas is about 20% of SPP. So if you think about projects that are regionally allocated, then that's the share that Kansas customers would be bearing of those regionally allocated projects. If a project is located physically in Kansas, depending on the voltage, there may be more allocated to the zone. But the regional share is closer to 20%. I don't know if that answers your question, Josh.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I mean, the local projects, when they're dedicated to the local zone, I mean, those costs in those projects, they're staying local, right?
Yes, if they are less than 100 kV or not directed by SPP, so they don't fall into this category at all.
Right. Yeah, that's helpful. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Maybe let me ask one clarifying question to extend that. I think Josh asked about the amount of TDC that is driven by out-of-state projects. My understanding is that the majority of the total TDC is what we call Schedule 9 charges. So those would be local projects. Is that correct, Kayla? So at least we could very roughly say the majority of what's in the TDC are not out-of-state charges for out-of-state infrastructure. Is that at least an accurate statement?
Yeah, Chair French, it's Darren Ives. You hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you.
Yeah, you're right. I would say the vast majority of the TDC is the local planning projects that we're working on that are staying in Kansas.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I think that I just wanted to make sure, because that seemed like that was directly maybe some of the feedback that Mr. France was hearing. So it's appreciate the answer on that. Okay, go ahead, Ms. Messamore. Go ahead with the presentation.
I have one question, Chair French, if I can.
Yep.
Oh, go ahead, Leo Hanna.
This is Leo. I was wondering if you could remind me again what the local planning criteria is for Evergy, and if it's the same across the SPP or even across Kansas.
No, so our local planning criteria are posted on our Oasis site. So everyone has to, if they are a transmission owner. They have to post their local planning criteria on Oasis, and it's very long, so I can't really summarize all of it here, but we're also working through the process of developing zonal planning criteria with others in our zones. So that process is kind of midstream right now. But once that is completed, assuming we come to an agreement on zonal planning criteria, there would be planning criteria at the zone level instead of at the local level.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
And
Anything
it looks
else?
like you may have some slides on your local planning criteria or processes later on, so maybe we can get deeper into that here in a few slides.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about what types of things are included in local planning later. We're not planning to get into specifics around voltage criteria and others in this setting, but we will cover it more.
All right, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, so moving to our planning process, so separate from the SPP efforts, although they can kind of interact with each other, we have a process where we move through from identifying specific needs on our system. We identify potential solutions, whether that be projects that are identified specifically to fix a local issue on a specific line or in a certain substation, or we might have programs where we're doing, as the name implies, programmatic replacements across a certain asset type, as opposed to just focused in one certain area. From there, once we have a need and identify a solution, we'll create estimates for those solutions, and then we'll prioritize the projects based on the relative benefits, kind of how well are they addressing the need versus how much do they cost in order to address that need. This is where we'll spend a decent amount of our time today, is kind of on the first half of this process, where we think about what do specific needs look like, how do we think through what types of solutions are best to meet those specific needs, and then how do we prioritize? Because what's noted in orange here is that we always have more needs and potential solutions than can be addressed in any given year or any 5-year period. So a lot of what we spend our time on is thinking through what is the highest priority item to address right now, and what's going to give the most value from that investment. Because once those projects are prioritized, then we'll have our final budgets created, and then we move into execution. Steve Vetch will cover a little bit about execution later in the process, but it's important to remember that transmission and substation projects take a really long time to execute generally. So our typical construction timeline from when it's put in the budget to when it's in service is going to be from 36 to 48 months typically. So that's a very long process from when the solution is identified to when it is finally completed. So that's just important to remember with the lead time on these types of projects. Another thing I'll note is that the prioritization process is fairly dynamic, where we'll reassess the relative priority of projects every year as we go through the budget, because things change. We have new mandatory projects come up that have to be addressed, for example. And so projects may get shifted around in different budget years. I think that's important to remember for this process, because we'll be reviewing projects for the upcoming 2 budget years in this presentation. Some of them have already moved outside of the 2-year window for in-service because of reprioritization. That will be an ongoing thing in this process, because we're continually addressing or reprioritizing, and things may move in and out of the budget each year. A reminder, this is focused specifically on transmission projects. So what we think of as projects are those very specific, focused on a specific line or focused on a certain substation that are targeted efforts, as opposed to the programmatic replacement of assets across an area, for example. If you look specifically at those projects, about 3/4 of it are performance, which are those projects identified to address age, condition, local planning needs, or operational issues. And then the other quarter is for mandated projects, which are road moves, new customers, those things that are not discretionary, and we have to perform them for certain customer needs or compliance needs. That would also include any projects identified by SPP that we have a notification to construct for. And so when we think about how we score projects within those two different categories, this is the process or the math that we use to assign a certain quantitative score to each project when we're looking at all the different options in our system and what is the relative ranking of them. Mandated projects just automatically get a very high score because they move to the top of the list because they are required. But when we're thinking about performance projects, we change this quantification method basically every year because we're always trying to make it better and make it a better gauge of how we think about the relative value of different projects. But for this most recent year, these are the types of things we're looking at of customer reliability. Essentially, to what extent would this project assess the risk of an outage, improve on a known issue with the design of a line or a substation? Is it alleviating congestion, congestion management events, which is a measure of operational impact from a project? And does it mitigate the risk of a future overload? So those are all the types of things we're looking at in customer reliability. For transmission projects, that's the majority of the score. So that ends up being the primary driver of the quantitative ranking of a project. But then we're also looking at public impact, which is, would a risk of an outage impact a critical customer? Would it create some sort of potential broader public impact risk, whether that could be a heightened wildfire risk or anything like that? That's less common, but it is an area that we look at. Employee benefit. The first one I think is worth explaining, reducing employee safety risk. So if a project is required to alleviate a safety risk where there is no safe workaround to do work on that project. So basically, if there is no way to do work on that line safely, that's a required project. If we have a workaround, but it just makes it take longer, or it's just not an ideal way to do the work, that's the safety risk that we would alleviate through a performance project, which is kind of in line with workforce productivity of making it easier to do maintenance on the line, for example, or in the substation. Those are the types of things we're looking at in employee benefit. And then finally, growth in technology is looking at, does this implement new technology, or does this support moving to more standard equipment and voltages across the system, anything like that. So we'll spend, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just had didn't mean to cut you off. I had a question about these percentages. Should I think about those as a weighting system to help identify projects? Or I know you said they change every year as you look at projects and sort of make a judgment call on what you need to do. Instead of weighting, are these maybe fallout percentages after the projects have been identified, or is it or is it maybe kind of a combination of both, but that they're a fallout, but they're a check for you to try to decide if that's a kind of an appropriate distribution of projects? If you could just give me some more context of how you use those percentages and the scoring system.
Yeah, so the percentages shown here are more of a weighting, because what we'll cover in the next few slides is that most projects do not fit cleanly into just one category or just one driver. They have a lot of different drivers. And so we'll look at to what extent does this alleviate a customer reliability issue? That's 44% of the score. Does it also alleviate a public impact? Okay, then that's another 13%. Same with employee benefit and growth in technology. So it's sort of building up to an overall score based on to what extent it has each of these categories of drivers.
Okay, I'll wait for the additional discussion.
Okay. All right. So like I said, this scoring system is trying to put a little science to the art of looking at to what extent does something impact customer reliability risk, or what are the different types of things that a project could assess. So that's what we'll cover here with this slide with all these illustrative charts on it. But tying back to the earlier slide, we had 6 different things on the list of specific needs. And so we tried to put those in 3 different buckets here, and then we'll talk about how those things all compound each other and how we're looking at them over time. So first is aging condition. I think that's the one we've spent the most time talking about in past workshops, specifically age. Is we do have a system across our territory that is aging. A lot of it was built back in the 50s, 60s, or earlier, as some of the ones we talk about today were. So we have all of these assets out there that are aging. You need to look at, over time, the risk that that age or that condition will be a problem. It kind of steadily increases, and then all of a sudden you reach a point where failure is pretty likely, which is where that blue chart on the right kind of ticks up. So when we're looking at priority over time, what we're trying to assess back with that scoring system is, okay, how old is it and in what condition is it, and how close are we getting to that point where the risk of failure is going to step up? Because you want to try and replace things before you get to that failure, obviously. That's for age and condition. It's a little more straightforward. Steve will talk about how we assess condition, because a lot of times condition is just as important as the age. You can know how old it is, but it's more just as important to look at it and to see in what condition is it, what has it been subjected to, and is it starting to show signs of failure soon. Next is local planning. Like we covered earlier, we'll talk about this quite a bit, but this is looking at, given expected growth on the system, whether it's new customers or just growth of existing customers, what capacity is needed on the system to maintain reliability. And then are flows on the system changing because of new generation additions or retirements? And how is that changing the flows on the system or the voltage performance within our criteria? We'll look at all of those things holistically across an area to identify projects that improve the system's ability to perform given how it operates today. And then last is operational issues, which we'll cover in more detail. Those are situations that we are mitigating where we will have an issue appear in real time. Typically, that's going to be caused by an outage on the system, which then creates a contingent overload that Steve will explain in more detail later. But it's essentially saying that we have to operate the system at N-1 at all times, which means we are operating the system as if the next thing has failed, simplistically. So when you have an outage occur, you are now having to operate the system as if two things have failed. That can create different risks and make it harder to manage flows on the system in real time. So we will sometimes do projects to mitigate those types of needs. And like I mentioned, in reality, most projects, not all projects, but a lot of projects have all three types of benefits. So it will be something that's aged on the system, that is getting older and the condition is worsening over time. It will have something where we know we need capacity there in the future because load is growing or because generation is being added. And we know that in certain operational situations, we have issues related to that part of the system. So we can do a project that addresses all three types of issues. And one of the projects in this year's filing is a good example of this. So we'll highlight that when we get there. But this is what we're trying to do, is look at over time, the risk in all three of these categories is increasing or changing based on system conditions. How do we time the project with that increasing risk over time to try and not do it too early, but not do it so late that then we have an outage or an operational event because we haven't addressed it proactively. So that's what all of this is doing. That's what that scoring system is intended to do, but some of it can be a little bit more art. So this is the high level thought process that we use to think through all of these different projects. So that I will pause and I'm going to hand it over to Steve next. So this is one of the section breaks. Chairman French, if we want to have some questions.
All right. Let's see if there are any questions. I don't see any hands, probably because we went ahead and interrupted you. But let's pause just a second to see if I see anybody come off of mute or turn their camera on. I don't see anybody yet. Let's go ahead and you said we're turning to Mr. Vetch at this time?
Yes.
Yeah, can you, Chairman, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just great. Why don't we go ahead and turn it to you, Mr. Vetch?
Well, very good, and good morning, everybody. Today I'll be discussing how we assess the health of our assets, what we do with the knowledge we learn with that assessment, how we determine how we're going to do maintenance or replacement of those assets, and We'll spend a little bit of time talking about cost containment on the projects, and at the end, we'll go through each of the projects in what I'll call a high-level detail, the ones that are kind of within the confines of the statute. So I'll begin on slide 12. And age and condition, and Kayla touched on this here a little bit this morning. Age in and of itself is not a driver of a candidate for a project. We have a lot of assets out there that are what I would call seasoned or well tenured, that are you know, performing well. They're not a risk to us. We don't think they're at any higher risk of an interruption or a failure than something that might be I guess less old. But it really comes into is the condition of the assets, and certainly the condition more often than not gets worse over time, which I think is sensible and logical to most folks. And the way that we assess the condition is a couple of different ways on the transmission system. The first thing we do is every year we do an aerial inspection of our entire transmission system. There's a photo on the right, I think, of this last year's inspection and things that we were finding on this line. And the picture is one of the projects we'll talk about in a little more detail later. And then every 12 years, we do a more intrusive excavation of all the wood poles on our transmission system. We're really trying to determine the level of decay that we're going to see or feel inside the pole, and make a determination as to the resilience of the pole. With the decay that we're finding, is it in a candidate for immediate replacement? Is it something that can wait? Do we have a larger plan, maybe just a few years down the road, that we can, I guess, survive until we get there? But generally, from a condition standpoint on the transmission system, both visual and then an excavation and more intrusive inspection of the poles. I'm going to move ahead one slide. So the maintenance and replacements, rebuild. So we don't generally go from an inspection and taking the knowledge that we learned from an inspection to rebuilding the line. And it's very similar to what we might do with our vehicles. And I wasn't planning on this, but it just happened here a couple of weeks ago. My wife and I had an issue with the motor in our vehicle, right? So we took it in. The solution to fix it, the first solution was, I think, 35% of the value of the car. A new motor was 55% of the value of the car, and a new car was about 2.5 times the value of the car for the same model. So we were kind of in the same doing mental gymnastics, if you will, on best path forward here, I guess, for us. We ultimately ended on maintenance for a car that had about 100,000 miles on it. And we do that on the transmission system as well. So we're assessing, okay, what is the issue? How long has it been in service? What do we think the expected useful life will be here? How critical is the line? And we generally go from maintenance to targeted replacements, and at some point in the future, needing to rebuild. Not always. Targeted replacements, I think, are the place where maybe not as easy to identify for a lot of folks, because generally these are parts of our system that you just can't see from the road. If you had a stretch of a couple miles or a few spans that went through a valley that were subjected to higher winds more often than potentially the rest of the line. We have parts of our transmission system that certainly traverse wetlands that age a little bit quicker than other parts of our system. But anyway, just an example of how we're approaching the maintenance, the replacements, and at some point the risk gets to a place where rebuilding just makes more sense than the maintenance or the replacements of the assets. Yeah, local planning. So Kayla had touched on this a little bit as well. At Evergy, certainly we have a local planning department, a team of folks who spend their days, their weeks, their months, their years, some of them their entire careers, analyzing, assessing, and determining for us and for our customers what the best plan forward would be on our system holistically, and certainly parts of our system. And by spending as much time looking at our system and all the kind of intricacies that it brings to the table, our team just has more knowledge, and they're just much more familiar with the nuances of our system than is the Southwest Power Pool. And with that knowledge comes, quite frankly, ideas that the Southwest Power Pool just doesn't consider and really isn't in their purview. A couple examples of that is just simply age and condition. So the Southwest Power Pool is not really considering the age and condition or even really how reliable our lines or circuits may or may not be. But that's certainly something that we think is critical because, if we have a single line feeding a substation, if you will, a radial line, and it were to fail, that is, obviously something we would like to avoid because our customers and we are going to be interrupted and be out restoring the power. The other, I touched on a little bit, the radial line. So if we have a radial line and over time, if the load is growing in that portion of our service territory, it may be we get to a place where we don't feel comfortable with that portion of our service territory being served by a single line and the outage dependent upon one line staying into service. So we may consider adding a secondary line into that part of our service territory. And those are just thoughts, ideas, plans that the Southwest Power Pool just wouldn't consider. And I'll pause there. I don't know if anyone has any questions. And I too, I'm happy to be interrupted, Commissioner.
Well, that's great, Mr. Vetch. I think just for clarification, Mr. Hanos asked earlier about local planning criteria, and it's my understanding these are detailed criteria, but these would be the categories, the general categories of what would go into your local planning criteria. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So, new load or load growth would certainly be something that we would do and wouldn't, probably require a lot of, deep consideration or thinking from a decision-making standpoint. Low voltages, substation configuration, dependent upon how the system is designed today, how it's configured, how it's behaving. Those are all things that our local planning department is looking at and taking into kind of a risk assessment. But those are, I would say not a total list of all the things that we're considering, but certainly I think the high points of the things that our local planning department is considering when determining how we best go forward.
And I don't want to mischaracterize anything here, so you're going to have to help me out. But is it fair to say there's been some activity in local planning criteria where in the past, I know you won't like this characterization, but it maybe has been pretty discretionary and not terribly transparent of how a utility plans its local system and identifies projects. But now these local planning criteria under some new rules at FERC and SPP, these local planning criteria do have to be publicly available and subject to review by everybody within those zones. Can you describe sort of what's going on now in developing and posting the local planning criteria?
Well, I'll tell you what, I could venture out past the end of my skis here, no trouble at all, but I'm going to hand it over to somebody that's just much more equipped to kind of get to the end of all of what you asked there. So Katie, Anand, if you wouldn't mind.
Yep. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Hi. So yeah, SPP has recently passed some additional requirements for us to work with the customers and transmission owners in our zones to develop zonal planning criteria. And we've been working on that since last year about this time. I think we started talking with our customers about what they wanted to see in a criteria, what we wanted to propose as a criteria, starting with our local planning criteria. So we are continuing to work on that. We are required by SPP to have a zonal planning criteria if there is one, agreed upon by the zone by March 31st, April 1st. So we're working on that. Hopefully we can come to an agreement, and then as a part of that zonal planning criteria, we're also working on the zonal planning process to help with that transparency and visibility of everyone in the zone to be able to see those projects that are going into the zonal rates.
All right. That's exactly what I was wondering and was going to ask about the timeline. So it sounds like this spring is when we're hoping to have sort of the next step and some agreement. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Caleb, you would skip ahead one, please. Thank you. Operational issues. So on the transmission system and in transmission operations, we talk about N-1, N-2, N-3. It's basically a measure from the system being absolutely intact. All the generators are available, all the substations are available, all the transmission lines are available. And then we start taking pieces of the system away. And at what point would the system become unstable? At what point would portions of our system lose customers, or just be at a point where the next failure of an element on the system would cause the system to have to really shed load, or it would essentially take care of itself. So that's a place that we're always working to avoid. We've got a project that we'll talk about here a little bit later that is in kind of this space, but just kind of want to talk about, the system in its totality. You can lose a lot of elements. We had a lot of operations on our transmission system yesterday. The system wasn't in jeopardy, but it was becoming less reliable, I guess, as a result of some of those lines being out of service. And at some point, there's a tipping point. I think in the technical conference, I used the analogy of it kind of being like a Jenga. Some pieces you can take out, and it's not as critical as some of the other pieces. So this is how we approach our system when we're always trying to stay away from that place where the next single failure on the system causes us to have to shed load, or the load shedding itself, which would even be worse. So. Okay, we're moving into the project details place, or portion of our presentation. One of the things, and if you would bump ahead one more, and I think Carly went through this thoroughly here at the beginning of the conversation today. Projects that are included and that we're going to be talking about today are greater than $15 million of investment in Kansas. They're set to be in service either this year or next and be included in our TDC filings. The plan, I will say this, there's kind of a bullet on the bottom there, is the plans are generally pretty firm, but not always as firm as we would like them to be. There's things that happen out there that may change the trajectory of something we were planning to do, although later than we would have wanted. And we have a project that's included in our detailed list here that fits the bill there. But anyway, just kind of want an overarching overview of what's included here and why. Okay, summary of projects included in our filing. The takeaway, I think, on this slide, at least for me, is when we're choosing projects to execute on that are coming from the local planning area, we are choosing projects that we believe are tackling or solving for more than one issue. So if you look at the 3 columns to the right, there's a lot of X's on a lot of the projects that cover all 3 of those. And that I think is just a better use of our investment dollars, and certainly I think a benefit to the customers from a cost standpoint, that we're, don't have a line that's aged, and our immediate response is just to go replace what's there with the same voltage. We're looking at, okay, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, what do we expect to happen in this portion of our service territory? And in drawing up a plan that has, kind of fits the bill of what we expect to happen. The mandated customers, certainly no real choice there. If folks want to locate in Kansas, we are happy to have them, and we will make sure that we are prepared to serve them when they get here. And then the agent condition, at some point, you get to a place where even if there are no other issues to solve but agent condition, the risk of having those assets to continue to be kind of out there is just greater than it should be. So we'll execute on those projects as well. Once we've determined that we're going to execute on a project, one of the first things we do is determine where that project is going to reside. So we, from a transmission line standpoint, determining where the center line of the line is going to be. At that point, our engineering department engages. They will engineer the line, all of the tensions in many aspects of the line, and put that what we call an IFC package out for bid. So we will get all of what we need together from a material standpoint, and we will put those packages out to the market. By doing so, we drive a lot of competition for our business, and that helps keep our costs in check, where folks are competing for the work that they would do on our property. There are certainly for materials as well. We'll have requests for proposals for materials. There are some materials that are so large and so complex that changing, vendors every so often doesn't make a lot of sense, and it creates a risk that we'd like to avoid. So with those types of assets, we have alliance agreements and long-term agreements with our manufacturers that have index-based pricing or negotiated every few years, and basically give us some assurance that we know where the market is for these pieces of equipment, and that our manufacturers are treating us fairly. After we get the results from the responses for the request for proposals, certainly do the analysis to determine the best value, usually cost being the driver there, not always. And the project is assigned to a project manager. The project manager is responsible for the entire project from beginning to end. They are certainly tracking the progress, making sure that the project is staying on track, if you will. Every month, the project managers, all of them, come into a room and we have a meeting that discusses how each project is progressing, things that are different than we thought they may have been earlier, what the drivers for those differences are, what the cost implications for those differences are, and if we need to adjust either in the short term or the long term. And really, for us that, can drive, changes to our longer term plan if there's large variances from what we thought was going to be to what is. It happens, I would say, not often, but on occasion. Certainly in the last few years on the, other side of COVID and what we saw with inflation, there was a lot of price escalation that was, I would say, a little bit new and different than we had seen for the probably 15 years that preceded it. So we were having I guess we were having more changes than we had historically in this arena, but I think we've kind of gotten caught up here, and this has flattened out for us a little bit. So it's been pretty good as of late. Okay, this is the first of the specific projects that we're going to go through. Kayla talked about it at the very beginning. This is what I call a detailed high-level look, if you will. Certainly we'll try to provide more detail if it's wanted. Certainly welcome the interruptions if somebody has a question, but we'll have some limitations as to what we can share in a public forum. So the first project for us, let me move this just a little bit. Okay, first project for us solves local planning and an operational issue. So this is, as we were talking about before, an N- driven project. As you can see, as it says in the Wichita division, and this is a place on our system where we have a known overload issue. We are dependent upon local generation when the load is high in that area, and if we had a failure of either the plant or a transformer, the lines around it in this area would not be capable of handling all the load. So adding in additional path into this area, creating another layer of redundancy to this portion of our service territory. If we got to a place here where we were in a load shed event, it would be fairly significant. So certainly something we'd like to avoid. And we'll just add that last summer we were, I wouldn't say dangerously close to being in that space, but nearing a place where it was becoming very uncomfortable. So this project, although it's been in planning, design, and execution for several years now, will be operational here before summer of 2024. So looking forward to having that behind us.
So is this an upgrade from a 69 kV line to a 138 kV line, and then the substation work on either side of that? Is that
Yes,
what this is? Okay.
that's
Okay.
exactly what it is.
Okay, gotcha. And one clarifying question here, because I'm guessing this is the nomenclature on each slide. It says TFR spend. I assume that is a federal transmission formula rate, and it's the total spend, and that may not be the full amount that ends up going on the Kansas jurisdictional TDC, correct?
Well, I could say that the way that you framed that up, that could be true. I don't believe that would be true with this project.
Okay. just want to make sure it's clarified that that's that's the input into your federal TFR. It's not necessarily the input into the TDC. Sorry, I didn't mean to be addressing rate making questions to you.
No, you're good. I probably beyond a little bit what we were planning on getting into today, Commissioner. Not that we can't loop back or follow up with you on exactly the question that you're asking there.
I just wanted it for clarity since this is a work study on the TDC and here we're referencing the TFR. That's all I was trying to do.
Yeah, Chair French, it's Darren Ives. That's exactly right. You framed it up well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, our second project is a substation rebuild or replacement. Our current substation resides in the parking lot of a church. Certainly far from ideal. I know when we were showed the slide or the pictures at the technical conference, it was probably a little bit easier to understand why we would like to move that substation. But the proximity to the church, although a driver for the project, isn't the only driver for the project. It solves age and condition, local planning, and operational issues. This line, although served from a couple different sources, both of those sources cannot be energized at the same time. So this substation is essentially always on a radial feed. It's had 5 outages between 2017 and 2020, and we just don't have a way to effectively pick up the customers when the substation goes out. So the outages tend to be a little, or I guess a lot longer than we would experience normally on other substations. So a candidate for replacement, and I believe goes into service yet this year. This is a project that we're doing near Hutchinson. Again, it's a conversion of a 69 kV line, associated substation work to facilitate the conversion from 69 to 115. I can tell you, and we talked about it a little bit at the beginning from a local planning issue or local planning plan, and things that they're looking at that other folks just may not look at. So as a result of converting this line from a 69 to a 115 kV line, we're very, very confident that that will eliminate the need to rebuild 69 kV lines in the urban part of this territory at some point in the future. This part of our service territory has a lot of urban 69 kV lines, and by converting these lines to a 115 will drive the future elimination of maintaining or rebuilding the 69 kV lines that are there and the substations they serve. So I think long-term, a really good plan. Okay, 115 kV rebuilds in and around the Topeka area. The pictures probably say a lot more than I can effectively say here, but I will say this. So we have 5 transmission lines that cross the Kansas River at this part of our service territory. 2 of those lines will be retired at the end of our project here. The other 1 will be rebuilt. When the 1 line is rebuilt, it will have more capacity than the 3 that are there today would have in total. So an addition of capacity with just a single rebuild. We're also replacing the river crossing structures on the remaining 2 lines that are just a little bit east of the 2 structures you see there. We'll move those lines into the same corridor, so shrinking our footprint up a little bit in this part of our service territory. At some point, the lines certainly deviate and go different directions, but kind of in the effort of trying to reduce our footprint, moving the lines closer together. All of the stuff that you're seeing kind of in the bottom 2 pictures, all of that will be retired, removed. So, although I haven't talked to the person that owns this land, I'm going to assume that they're going to be really thrilled with us when we're complete here.
So will you retire the easement on that portion as well, or will you continue to hold it?
No, we will not hold the easements there. If we had for some reason a need to have a line that was not in service, but thought we maybe potentially might need it to be in service in the future, we would hold the easements, but we're not planning to do that in this case.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, this is a 138 kV line rebuild, solving for age and condition, local planning issues. We've talked about this line before in several of our other conversations. This is the worst performing line of its voltage in the Eastern Interconnect. Driving the number of hours that this line is out is generally lightning. It's also old and failing. A lot of compression sleeves on this line that were added at obviously sometime before, not sure exactly when, but they're creating a risk of the conductor failing. The line's 100 years old. It's just, there's really no other example in our service territory, probably more than this one, that says it's just time. Okay, this is a 69 kV line rebuild. When this line was originally put in, the poles that were used were the minimum design criteria of the time. So for the size of the conductor and the types of poles that were used, there couldn't have been a lighter or less robust pole used and still been within the standard of the time. So after 50 some years of being out there in the elements, although the wire weighs about the same as it did when it was installed, the ability of the structures to hold that wire up in the air has been diminished quite a bit. We see quite a few failures on this line. It serves a critical part of our service territory that only has 2 feeds. The other feed, although we've been maintaining it well here in the last few years, is of the same vintage. Again, it's time, and from a risk standpoint, in solving some local planning issues, this is a candidate for replacement.
Steve?
Yes.
Dwight Keene. Thank you so much for doing this. You're a real pro, and we appreciate receiving the benefit of your information. While you're on this slide here that is in this Pittsburgh area,
Yeah.
I'm sort of inferring from what you're saying that the replacement poles, they're going to be wooden as well. Is that the plan?
I don't think that is the plan, Commissioner. We are in the process of moving to steel direct embed poles for a variety of reasons. We are also not the only utility that believes this is the best path forward. So the ability to get those poles has been a little bit more difficult than we would have otherwise liked it to be. But our plan, certainly on this line, I believe, is to use direct bed steel direct embed poles, so, which essentially means a steel pole that doesn't have a foundation under, it's just directly embedded into the ground.
So this would be primarily for longevity and durability, I presume.
Yeah, I absolutely, for sure, those two things. I think it comes with over time less maintenance. It certainly is more resilient. We believe that based on our experiences with steel structures that we have that have been out there for 100 years in some cases, that the long-term value of steel, and certainly in places where you can directly embed it, is greater than using wood, even though in the initial installation, more costly.
Again, kind of going back to an old docket here, I feel compelled to ask you the next question. Don't try to mousetrap you here in the slightest. I take it that it would be your view, and it's a professional opinion I would certainly respect, that concrete or spun concrete would be less preferable than steel.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I probably don't have a definitive answer for you today, Commissioner. I will say this. We are investigating and have looked at, maybe not recently, the difference between steel and concrete. There are vast differences in weight. We don't have a ton of history using concrete, although it's not zero. The history we've had is mixed in terms of success. We are reassessing the use of concrete poles in our area. I think since the last time we had installed any in our system, it's been some time. I'm certain that the technology has improved since then. We're certainly don't dislike concrete or anything like that, but I think it's from what we have out there on the system, the amount of steel that we have relative to the amount of concrete that we would have or potentially could have, would we then be required to carry two types of different equipment that we wouldn't be required to otherwise to maintain the concrete, and then what additional costs come with adding a new type of structure to our system.
Sure. I appreciate the information. You've refreshed my recollection a bit too. Very well. Thank you for the information. I'm not trying to micromanage what you're doing here in any respect, but I am curious because I think obviously these kinds of decisions, as you're sensitive to, have cost implications associated with them as well as and benefits too. So you're going to make all those trade-offs.
No, I appreciate the questions. I think that's the reason why we're here is for folks to get their questions answered. So happy to do that. The cost implications are real, right? And we are very aware of this. That we understand how decisions that we make impact our customers, which are our families, our friends, the people that we go to church with and go to work with. So it's something we think about a lot. We take a lot of effort to make sure that we're able to come to a discussion like this with our chins up and be able to easily and logically defend the decisions that we're making in a way that folks can understand. And I think that's part of our charge.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay. Again, a 161 kV rebuild, a line from the 1950s. The pictures in the right, I think, tell the greater story. If you were to traverse this entire line, I would say most of the structures look very similar to the one in the picture. A drive or two of this project, and Kayla touched on this a little bit early in her comments from a safety standpoint. The wire on this line is so brittle that we would not allow anyone to work on this line while the line was energized. It's also what I would call a somewhat critical line, so taking it out of service often to do work on it, it's really not an option. So at the place where with a line from the 1950s, with a conductor in a state of being brittle and not able to be maintained while it's energized, it's time for a rebuild of the line. Okay, this project is a 160-169 kV greenfield substation in what I would say a somewhat rural portion of our service territory. This portion of our service territory is currently served by a little longer than a 20-mile 69 kV line. We have a 161 line that's about 10 miles away from this portion of our service territory, or this 69 to 12 kV substation as it sits today. So adding a 161 in and out into this part of our service territory solves what will be an age and condition issue on the 69 line at some point in the not too distant future. It also increases the voltage stability in this area and makes us much less dependent on the local generation in this part of our service territory. Substation rebuild, or what I'd say a relocation in Lawrence. We have a substation in Lawrence that lacks the breakers needed to effectively and reliably operate the system, at least to our standards in Lawrence. Adding this substation in Lawrence makes that part of our service territory and really for Lawrence much more reliable than it is today. We looked at can we add on to the substation that's there, but in the location where the current substation resides, that just wasn't an option. We're at a place where we're beginning dirt work in preparing the site for a transformer and all the things that will be needed to put this into service. But this will be what I would say a somewhat substantial improvement to the reliability in the flows around Lawrence. Okay, this is a 69 kV rebuild and a 138 conversion going in around the Independence area of our service territory. A couple of things being solved for here, certainly age and condition, planning issues, and operational issues. This line, probably in and of itself, from an age and condition standpoint, would be a candidate for a rebuild. But there's also an issue with this line that it's not large enough to meet the demands of the load when loads are high and we have transformers in and around the area that are out of service. Obviously, we try not to have all those things happen at the same time. But if we had an event where we lost a transformer, this is a portion of our service territory where the resilience or the redundancy isn't where we would like it to be. We have a 161 kV river crossing. This is in Missouri, but the allocator between the two jurisdictions would put this project at a price greater than 15 million for the Kansas Metro. This is also a project that originally was part of our plan. It's been delayed. The driver of the project was new load. The load was sufficient that the conductor traversing the river here would not have been large enough to serve the load. So the design called for a larger conductor, which made these towers inadequate. The towers are also aging, and from a condition standpoint, nearing the end of their useful life. We'll see, I guess, how this materializes in the future, but as of right now, this is although it was in the plan when we went to print, is kind of at least currently on the sidelines.
Steve, this says it's a 161 kV rebuild, but it also says it's currently a triple circuit converted to a double circuit, and there's a 69. Is that two 69 kV lines being converted into a 161 then, or could you just describe that a little more?
Yeah, absolutely, Chairman French. The 69 line, there's only one traversing the river here, will be retired, and there are two 161 circuits on these structures or on this river crossing, and both of those circuits require larger conductor than the conductor that's on that today. So certainly on a 3,000 foot span, adding any amount of weight really changes, I guess, the weight that the towers are supporting.
Gotcha. Yeah, that answers my question. So it is two circuits, both of a 161 kV, so pretty substantial infrastructure there. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
We have several projects all lumped up into the same area here near DeSoto, Kansas. So we're seeing a significant amount of load growth in and around this portion of our service territory. I would say the projects are broken into a couple of different camps here. There's the 115 portion of these projects, which is up closer to K10. And then with what we're seeing in this part of our service territory, the 115 kV system just not able to meet the needs of the growing demand in this area and required the addition of a 345 source. So you can see, kind of as you go down the projects here, what the impacts are of each piece of that 345 and the 115 kV improvements being made in this part of our service territory to serve the existing customers and the ones that are planning to locate here in the short term. And happy to take any questions. I know that was a quick flyover on a lot of things that are going on just the south side of DeSoto, but happy to just answer any questions that anyone might have regarding these handful of projects.
Well, I will just give a couple comments. I live just to the east of your blue box there and commute on Kansas 10 a lot of days, and have been closely watching all the impressive substation work that's going on. And I see some big new poles sitting around there within the last few weeks. So it looks like there is progress moving along, and also appreciate your team's work. I know there have been a lot of conversations with SPP about the infrastructure in that area and seeing if there can be some more optimal regional solutions rather than a piecemeal approach. And I see you've noted that in that last box there, or at a couple of the boxes. And I hope that will be an ongoing effort. We want to make sure that we build the best solutions for the future and for the entire region, rather than patching something together, perhaps at greater immediate cost to ratepayers. So appreciate that work.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little bit on to the end of that. My colleagues in the room here are certainly deeply involved in the conversations with the Southwest Power Pool, helping folks understand, the difficulties of actually executing on some of what was proposed previous to this plan. And then I think a credit to the pool as well. They took the time to sit down, they listened. I think they got to a place of understanding. And I think ultimately we landed in the best place possible. So I think from a long-term standpoint, and when you have assets that are serving customers for 100 years, as we've seen here today, approaching your plan with the long term in mind has long-term benefits, and I think that's exactly what occurred here.
And I see Commissioner Keene is on video. Commissioner Keene, am I rightly anticipating a question or comment?
Yes, you are. Yes, Steve. If I can kind of follow on the question that was just asked of you by Chair French. So is going back to maybe 10,000 feet here, as I look at slide number 31, I believe it would be fair to conclude that these are, for the most part, the costs and projects that would be directly associated with the Panasonic plant. Is that a fair generalization?
I would say this, Commissioner. Panasonic is driving some of this work. I would not say that it's driving all of this work. We had engaged in adding infrastructure to this portion of our service territory before we got the knock on the door from Panasonic. Absent of Panasonic, this was a growing portion of our service territory. Certainly the load addition that comes with the location of Panasonic south of DeSoto driving probably the things in what I would call the bottom three boxes.
Okay. If I can follow on to your response there, Steve, by going back, if we could drop back to slide 18 once again, please. All right. This is kind of the overview as I see it, as you indicate, of the near and intermediate term contemplated transmission operations. And so again, I certainly want to respect what you believe you can share in a public forum.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly want to do that. But I'm presuming that at least one of these projects represents in the main Panasonic project. I'm not asking you to identify, but I'm presuming that that's the case.
Can you say that one more time, Commissioner?
Sure.
I want to make sure I understand the crux of the question.
Sure. Well, I'm actually getting to the question. that was kind of a foundational question, actually.
Okay.
But the question is, I'm presuming that from this array of projects here, that at least one of these projects represents the main Panasonic project.
Yeah, there are, I think, 3 of the projects that are probably what I would say most specifically in flight due to Panasonic. So yeah, I mean, yes, I guess the answer to your question is yes, there are some portions of what you're seeing on the final slide there that are Panasonic specific.
Okay. Now, I'm not asking you, I'm going to the gist of the question now, Steve. I'm not asking you to make any further identifications here than you have already on this public slide. But my question is this: to what extent, if we hold aside those 3 projects that you're identifying as being sort of in the main concentrated around the Panasonic operations in their project, if we take the rest of those projects, my question is, to what extent are either direct or indirect costs associated with the Panasonic projects spread over other non-Panasonic projects?
Okay, so I'm going to frame this up in a way that I think that I would understand it. So is the question, the investments needed to serve Panasonic, how the investments and the associated costs associated with those are absorbed by somebody that, in addition to Panasonic and not just Panasonic?
Essentially, that's right. I'll ask the question again, and I'm not trying to mousetrap you here, but I simply, I mean, I know there's a large element of complexity associated with cost allocation,
Mm-hmm.
and I would take that as a given. But my question is really going beyond the 3 that I think you said are in this list that are most directly related to the Panasonic project. My question is, with respect to the other projects, to what extent are either direct or indirect costs that could be logically associated with the development of the Panasonic project to be incurred by some of those other projects?
Yeah, so I'll say this, and this is probably about as far as I can take this. Investments that are made that are only a benefit to Panasonic are absorbed by Panasonic. Investments that are made that are for the greater good of the grid are absorbed on a cost allocation, as Kayla had described earlier. Certainly, if the case, if we get a NTC approved here next month. So it just follows the lines of kind of cost allocation at that point.
And if I could add real quick, Commissioner Keen, so
Yes,
the projects that have an X in the mandated new customer column here are the ones that are on that last slide about DeSoto. So like Steve said, there's a few that are more directly related to Panasonic, but all of them are related to each other. So they're all kind of in that area of where Panasonic is going in service. The rest of these projects that don't have an X in the mandated new customer column are in separate parts of our service territory and are driven by things unrelated to load growth in the DeSoto area.
that's good. Thank you. I appreciate the response, your response, Kayla, as well as yours, Steve. In the main, that responds to my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
All right, let's pause here and see if there are other hands or anybody that wants to pop off of mute for questions to Evergy. Steve, I assume this is the end of the entire Evergy presentation, or at least it looks to be from the slide deck I had.
Yeah, I believe this is, absent any questions, kind of our jumping off point, Chair French.
Very good. Well, I'm not seeing any hands, and nobody is jumping up and down to ask a question. I was anticipating taking a short break, but we've actually made pretty good time, and so it's looking to me like we can probably wrap up fairly shortly. So I think let us move ahead. I understand that staff wanted to make a brief presentation and summary of what their review process is and next steps for these TDC filings. And so I will turn it to Chad Unrein for that presentation, and then Chad would be available, I assume, to field a few questions on staff's process if folks have questions. So Chad, why don't I turn it to you if you're ready?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. So obviously this is the first year of the transmission delivery compliance workshop. It's primarily to give kind of the commission as well as staff a more detailed overview of transmission investment in the near term and kind of the drivers of what's going on from a zonal perspective from Evergy. When we look at this process kind of playing out, staff issued 55 data requests through this particular process, covering project budgets, information about individual projects, all of which some were provided on a confidential basis, and others were included in staff's transmission workshop that Evergy was able to kind of provide fuller responses, I guess, than maybe what is being presented in this particular public workshop. Staff participates in the transmission process in various ways outside of this. On the TFR perspective, which really kind of serves as a foundational purpose for transmission investment in Evergy's zone, as well as regional investment that flows back into the TDC. We use the FERC Form 1 and we audit that process of the transmission formula rates. There's a true-up process that occurs in May, which would, for this particular year, true up 2022. And then that 2022 annual formula rate is used for the 2024 projection, which then kind of flows into the TDC. When we looked at the drivers of the TDC, Justin kind of looked at the individual investment. I mean, it's around 70% of the TDC is primarily made of local planning. And so that's the process kind of by which we look at the cost allocation and the drivers of individual investment in the zonal projects and how that flows back. The TDC, the amounts in the transmission formula rate are split out kind of on a wholesale versus retail demand allocator. And then that amount then flows back into the TDC. On the retail side of Evergy Central, approximately 82% of the zonal is related to retail, the retail portion of the TDC. And then on Metro side, it's closer to, I think, around 86% flows back to retail. And then that would be split between Kansas and Missouri jurisdictional customers. And so we participate in all of these processes, from, challenges that may be issued at FERC on the transmission formula rate, because all of these individually affect both the retail and wholesale side of who's paying, for the transmission investment in SPP. And so that yearly process, this was supposed to enhance that part of the process and give us a better understanding and get a better project by project breakdown of, what's affecting the TDC and TFR, in the near term for Evergy. We issued those data requests in this particular year. I mean, obviously these projects are budgeted for 2024, 2025. In future years, we'll be able to kind of look over budget to actuals and provide maybe some more in-depth view of, how much actually flowed into the TDC on a budgeted basis. And so this is really kind of a first year overview. And then I guess from a work product going forward, what staff had planned to do is each year in those TDC updates and approval for roll-in from the retail side, staff issues a report and recommendation covering our audit and of the TDC application. And so staff had planned to basically pull in this TDC compliance workshop into kind of a report and recommendation form in that TDC filing, because that's ultimately what's going to flow into the costs that are charged to retail ratepayers. And so we plan to expand that report and recommendation to kind of cover this TDC compliance filing process, and advance maybe future discovery kind of going forward, that we can kind of outline maybe some of the cost drivers and cost allocation processes. But from the retail side, we participate in the transmission formula rate process and then audit the TDC filings. And this was just supposed to provide a better advance of near-term project investment for Evergy.
Well, thank you, Chad, for that outline of the mechanics of how this all flows to retail customers, retail and wholesale customers, and the outline of how staff participates in both jurisdictional and non-jurisdictional proceedings, and how this new process will enhance our view going forward to get a little more transparency. Let me ask at this time if there are any questions for staff on their review and audit process.
Chair French, I'm going to walk the plank on this one a little bit. Chad, I'm going to direct this to you, but I see we have a fair number of staff that are tuned into this as well. This question perhaps is most appropriately directed to Leo, but I'll kind of let you determine that. As I understand it, some of these projects that we've been apprised of and we've discussed today are in some phase, some of them are in some phase of an SPP NTC process. Am I reading that correctly? Steve, could you answer that? I think I'm correct on that, am I not?
Yes.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct on that, Commissioner. We're hopeful, at least on the ones that are, I think, of the most significance. Believe we'll get an answer here within the next 3-4 weeks. Is that in the ballpark? Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, with that kind of overview, I guess my question is essentially this, and Leo, you may be the target of this, to be honest. As these SPP NTC proceedings progress and that deliberative process proceeds, does either SPP or Evergy work with staff to address local concerns that we might have or other issues we might have identified as local concerns? Do they do this on an ongoing basis? And if so, how?
I'll see if I can answer that, Chair, or excuse me, Commissioner French, or Commissioner Keen, sorry. So I think you're alluding to the fact that will we have any siting considerations on these lines in and around the DeSoto area? And it's my understanding that those lines do not meet the criteria to have KCC siting. But I have been involved with Evergy on past projects that don't meet that siting criteria, and they still have the same type of public outreach that they go and reach out to people, let them know where the lines are going to be built, get feedback from the public regarding the actual route they're building on. So I would assume that's going to be the process. I've not heard of any meetings that are going on at this time regarding that. They may have already taken place.
Okay. Well, that's really responsive to the question. I think past this prologue, I think without too much deliberation, you can kind of see the genesis of my question and where it stems from. But thank you. I think that's quite responsive. Thank you, Leo. And I would entertain any additional thoughts that Evergy may have. Steve, if you care to add anything to that.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything top of mind or anything to add, Commissioner. I appreciate the conversation today. I thought it's productive and progressive, I think, for everyone. So, yeah, nothing to add at this point.
Thank you.
Commissioner Keen, I might just add, it's not really responsive. I share some of your thoughts and got the aim of your question. I have a little different comment on that question, though, of sort of the engagement with SPP about NTCs and the purpose for that. And I'll certainly let Evergy disagree with me here, but my understanding and the way I look at this is these are probably projects that Evergy has decided that they are going to go forward with in their local planning process one way or another. And the way that they look at engaging with SPP to see about whether these could be included as an NTC is a process to help SPP understand the regional value of some of these larger projects. And to the extent that SPP can identify them as a regional or base plan funded project, then we would be able for cost sharing from the entire region, which will benefit Kansas customers. So I guess that would be the additional perspective I would put on that process and back and forth with SPP. And if my comments need clarification or qualification, I would certainly appreciate that.
I don't think it needs any. I'll just add a little bit. I think the projects we talked about on the last slide in the DeSoto area are a good example of how we try to work with SPP on sort of bridging the gap between what we see from a local perspective and what they see regionally. So SPP, when they were looking regionally at that area, had identified a set of solutions that we didn't see as optimal for the long term. So then we talked with KCC staff, we talked with SPP, we talked with a bunch of people to work through that process and ultimately to get to a outcome with an NTC that we thought was optimal long term. So it is very much a back and forth. Those projects in the DeSoto area are a good recent example, but we are having similar conversations about different areas of our system with SPP all the time.
Well, thank you very much. Kayla, thank you very much for that information. Chair French, the granularity that you've added to an overview of what my concern is very helpful too. I thank both of you.
All right. Are there any additional questions for KCC staff on their review process, audit process, process of looking at the federally jurisdictional TFR, anything Chad covered? All right. I am not seeing anything. So I think we are at the conclusion of everything I've expected for today's work study. Brian, let me check with you to see if I've missed anything. I see you're on camera, so you've targeted yourself.
Yeah, my mistake. No, if you've missed it, I've also missed it. So I think we're good.
All right, very well. Well, let me just express my appreciation for everyone who's been with us today to present and answer questions. We certainly appreciate all the time that went into both Evergy and staff preparing for this work study and to give us the information through this new process. We look forward to having this on an annual basis as we move forward. So thank you so much to everyone. And at this point, I will close the work study and adjourn our session. Thank you all.